Hey everyone, welcome back to the White Coat Club.
Today,
We're going to talk a little bit about how much AP scores really matter for BSMD admissions. This is definitely something that comes up a lot around this time of year and honestly during application season as well. And so we're excited to kind of spread some news about this. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to like and subscribe to get more BSMD and med school admissions advice. Right. So Nicole, do you mind telling us a little bit about the importance of a rigorous course load?
essentially, BSMD programs want academically strong students who can handle the med school course rigor. Want to make sure that the students that they're selecting already have had a rigorous course load in high school. So AP, IB, dual enrollment courses all help demonstrate this type of readiness that the admissions counselors are specifically looking for. So, kind of with that, my question to you is AP scores versus AP classes. What do you think is more important?
It's a great question. I do think both are important. You do poorly in the class, but you do really well on the exam or vice versa. It's not necessarily maybe a flag, but it is kind of like a question of like, why didn't you do well in both? So ideally, the goal always is to do well in both. So you can send scores, hopefully get some college credit as well. Now, let's give a hypothetical situation. Let's say you don't do super well in one of your classes. Do you think you should send all your scores?
Not necessarily. I mean, the Common App even says it on there to indicate the tests that you wish to report, tests that you expect to take, and then the tests you've already taken. But it's what you wish to report. So you don't have to. Some BSMDs in the past have definitely asked for all of them on like a supplemental application. Ideally, I mean, again, ideally you do well on both. So I feel like probably 90%, maybe 80% of the time will tell students to submit everything, either because their scores and their grades are in alignment, or it just kind of makes sense to send everything in. Um, if there's a situation where someone did really poorly, I had someone this past year, she had like a 99 average in her AP bio class, but the day of the AP bio test, I think she was just getting over the flu and like she was out for like the whole week before and was like really struggling and did not do as well as she expected to. I think she got a 3. And I was like, you know what? Let's submit it. And we're not making excuses, but like things happen and we're gonna just still continue to submit. So I think it just depends if you're gonna submit everything or not. But it's definitely a item to discuss with your counselor. And I've spent a lot of time with my students discussing, which ones we're submitting, why not, and all of the details. Another thing to think about is sometimes check what your transcript says. So I've definitely had a situation where students like, I'm not submitting, and then their transcript already shows that they took it. So just double check with your school and see kind of what that official transcript's going to show to showcase it, whether you're going to or want to submit yourself or not. Lindsay, have you had students send in threes? What's your take on sending in threes?
It's so like as you said, it's so dependent. And so one thing that if you can only take away one thing from this podcast today is just make sure that this is general advice. Every student's going to be different. We will say some things here and just make sure to like consider your situation too. And so like if you are going for BSMD and you get a 3 in like a STEM class, like honestly probably won't suggest that you submit it. And then if it's a non-STEM class, like honestly, probably to submit it because then maybe you are getting like those general credits and things like that. If it's like an AP Gov or something like that. But yeah, it really does just depend. And we've had a lot of conversations and individual conversations with each student about like what makes sense for them. Because we'll be looking at like their transcripts, like how not just like, is it appearing on their transcripts, how well they did in the class, how well they performed maybe even on other AP classes as well. And what the whole picture, holistic picture looks like. So it's definitely not like oh yeah, you should always send your threes or, oh yeah, you should always not send your threes. I think every school, every student will be a little bit different.
I agree. Take it case by case and don't compare. Don't say, oh, well, my friend did this and she's submitting here. Everything is different. Really speak to someone. And this is definitely something that I recommend getting advice on. Put everything on the table and then we can decide, okay, this is what we're going to submit. This is what we're not going to submit.
And to end, do BSMD programs typically require scores?
No, they don't require them. They like to see that you've taken the courses, but they don't specifically require the scores, for the most part. And, I think I think that they're important. They do definitely like to see heavy AP courses for STEM, the bio, chem, physics, calc, all of those things. It just levels the playing field to have that score. If we're taking the classes, if you're a student, even if you're a parent listening, some teachers are super lenient with grades and give, not really much homework. Some are the complete opposite. So, you having a 95 in the class and someone having a 92, it's really hard to differentiate. But with the test, everyone in the nation is taking the same exact test. So it's a little bit easier to kind of like level that playing field. So they do like to see it, but they definitely like to see the courses. Kind of piggybacking off of that. So you don't have to take the test. It's not required. They'd rather that, that you definitely have to take the classes, I think, to be a competitive candidate. But do you recommend that everybody tests?
I mean, I always think yes. I've never had a situation where I'm like, oh yeah, I don't think you should take it. Because at the end of the day, like what's the worst that can happen? Like you don't get credit anyway because you didn't do well. If you didn't take the test, you weren't going to get credit either. And so you could do really well. You could surprise yourself. So I do think it's always a good idea to take the exam. The only time I guess I've had a kid decide not to take the exam is in their senior year. Like, let's say they were planning to take like the AP psychology exam. They're already obviously accepted into the school. Maybe that school doesn't give credit for AP psychology, even if you get a five. And so they might opt out of like taking the exam then. I think that's the only time I've ever really heard of it. And then just like notify the school of like their change in plans. But yeah, I think you should always be taking the exam, especially as a younger student. You don't know what schools you're going to get into. You don't know what credits you're going to get. So take the exam.
Yeah, I agree. Senior year, things might change, but at the same time, there's no difference to me in taking it and saying, wow, I really didn't do that well. I'm not going to submit my scores and just taking it and just seeing what happens.
100% completely agree. Yeah, what's the harm? Honestly, what's the harm at this point? Do you think like admissions officers like judge if you don't submit a score? Like, is that something that they're thinking about? Like, that they didn't study, they didn't do well, they didn't take the exam. Do you think that they're putting like too much thought into it?
I don't know. Because there's definitely some reasons why people just don't. Like I said, some people get sick, some people have family emergencies, like they plan to take it, they don't end up taking it. There's definitely other things that come up. For me, I just think about the student and like again, case by case. If they're like, oh, I just don't want to, I am like, well, you're not putting in 110% into your application, in my opinion. If you're like, I just don't feel like taking it. In that like, 9th, 10th, 11th grade year,
Yeah.
definitely. Especially for a course that is very important to your major.
Yeah, exactly. They might not judge, but they definitely have like one smaller piece that they're going to
Yeah.
on. So the reason might not be judged, but if you have another candidate who got fives and everything, will it help them?
Yeah.
You never know. So you always want to
Why
think
not give them everything,
of
you
the
know? And then you still have the option to not send it in later on.
exactly. You can always make that choice later if you don't do well. But if you don't take it at all, you don't have that choice. That choice is then taken away from you. So yeah, better to take.
So I get this question a lot. How many APs should you take? Or like, is there too many to take? I think having some balance, I think it just needs to make sense for you. I don't love when students are comparing and saying, oh, well, last year, this student from my high school got into Yale and she had 15 APs, so I need to have 15 APs. I think it needs to make sense for you and you need to have some balance. Think about your extracurriculars, think about your homework, think about the other things that you want to accomplish, and find a way to do all of that while still showcasing rigor. Because doing other things is also going to showcase rigor as well. I think there definitely can be a situation where you take too many and the things that you love to do start to slip or the grades start to slip. I'd rather you take, four and have all fives and all, high 90s in the class than take seven and then you were looking at like B's, right? So I think you need to find the balance that works for you.
Yeah, I think every school is so different too. Like every high school and their offerings are so different as well.
Mhm.
Like I've had some like freshmen and sophomores who can take multiple APs in those years. And then I have some kids who can only take like their first AP and just one in their sophomore year. And so you're not going to be punished by schools if like you weren't able to do what other kids could. Like, it'd just be impossible to have so many APs. Or like it might not even just like work with your schedule. Like you might have to do certain requirements and it just like can't work. The puzzle piece like doesn't the scheduling puzzle piece doesn't work to get that, AP computer science into your schedule as well. And so there are like all those like things that the admissions officers will be knowing. They'll know how many APs you had access to and like what the different restrictions are. So it's not like you're going to be punished as long as you took advantage of the opportunities you had, essentially. And that doesn't mean to take every AP, but really to kind of follow those interests and ultimately kind of figure out what's right for you. Kind of on that vein too, Nicole and I were talking about this before the podcast started about like different case studies. And something that definitely comes up, I feel like a lot with kids is you have to take like honors chemistry or honors bio before you can take AP bio and AP chem, whereas other schools will let you just jump right into it. It can totally depend too. And then of course it restricts how many APs you could be taking. And so yeah, it just really is so school dependent and they won't be comparing you equally.
I've even worked at schools where like the only Calc BC course that was offered, because it's such a small amount of kids that take it at the school, it was a small school that I worked at, was the exact same time as AP Chem.
Mm,
So if you hadn't already taken AP Chem, you couldn't take both. Like there was just literally no option. They were only offered at the exact same time. So this is something that I really recommend students kind of try to map out as early as possible. We always get questions about like what can you be doing in ninth grade? This is what you can be doing in eighth grade and ninth grade, mapping out when you're taking it. You can talk as a ninth grader and say, hey, how many sections of Calc BC do you guys have? Only one? Okay. And you only do one typically of like physics. Well, let me see if I can take one in 11th grade if they'll let me, because I want to do both. And like really try to map it out with your counselor in advance. Now, things change every year. So there's no guarantee that that's always going to work out perfectly, but it's something that you can try to do. It's just, you can try to control it a little bit.
yeah, because there's nothing worse than getting to your senior year and realize, oh crap, I actually cannot get in everything I wanted to.
Mhm.
And if I planned ahead a little bit better.
Yeah. And knowing the requirements, like you said, exactly right. Some schools will say, yeah, you could hop into AP bio, no problem. Or some say you have to take honors bio first. And
Mhm.
then I've had kids who are devastated. Well, it's going to make me miss out on something else. But now think about the admissions officers are saying, well, you have now have 2 years of bio under your belt versus someone that only has one.
Yeah,
So you can't, change the rules. You can only work with what you have.
I think that's a good way to thinking about it. Even though maybe it isn't the path you wanted, you'd self definitely still get some benefits out of it. Now, this kind of on that vein of maybe having APs, but what is if your school doesn't offer APs or only offers like a really limited number of APs? Would you recommend that students self study for those?
I think it depends. If you're really gunning for BSMD and your school does not offer AP bio or AP chem, which is probably very rare at
Yeah.
this point, I think I'd probably recommend self-studying, maybe one year, one another year. I don't think like, oh, they don't offer BC, but they offered AB and I took it. Like, don't, it's not worth it to me to self-study for BC. You can probably advance math in other ways. If they don't offer BC, but you might have the option for dual enrollment, and then you could potentially take a higher level math there. The AP piece of it isn't like as important. Now, I've definitely had kids who have self-study something they're really interested in. They couldn't fit AP Psych in their schedule just because it didn't work, but they really love psychology and they really want to do it. And their friends loved the class. They've self-studied for that. And I think that usually always works well because it's something that they love, that they're really interested in and love to do. What do you think on that?
So I do agree that, I think dual enrollment classes could be really nice. APs are also advantageous because they are standardized. So we could, they know exactly what your curriculum was. They know exactly what the AP exam was because every single kid in the country took it. And so if you got a five, they can compare you a lot easier to kids who also got a five. But if you like, because your school doesn't have AP exams, maybe you did take dual enrollment classes, like there just isn't, it isn't as standardized. So I guess that's like the only disadvantage of the dual enrollment classes. But dual enrollment can also be really nice because there are going to be usually classes outside of the standard curriculum sometimes. Like I had one boy this year he was like really interested in like public health and like those types of things. So he was able to take some dual enrollment, like public health classes, some sociology classes. And so when we were like working on his essays, when he was like working on his passion projects, he was able to incorporate some of that into his material. So I felt like that was quite good. you don't necessarily need to like be doing everything. So making sure, as we kind of talked about before, like managing that time and taking like different types of classes. Um, but I think dual enrollment can also be nice because it can like help you almost like skip some things. Like I think one of our coworkers, Alex, was talking about this, like how she had like one student who was like a little bit behind in math. And so over the summer, they did a dual enrollment class, or a community college class, I can't remember which, in the math. And then they were able to go to like AP calculus, whereas they wouldn't have been able to do that if they were like on their current trajectory. So dual enrollment can kind of be nice to help you like kind of jump over in biology or math or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I've had a lot of students who, they've typically taken like their AP Bio, their AP Calc junior year because then we're gonna have the scores to send to the schools, and that's great. So then senior year, it's the question of, well, what should I do? Should I just do like some kind of random other APs just to get that AP number higher, or should I continue to challenge myself? And I've had kids who do dual enrollment, differential calculus, multivariable calculus, advanced physics, like things like that. You're still showcasing that like I went as high as I could with the AP, and instead of then just taking random APs to fill my schedule for the year, I'm going to go above and beyond and, kind of go higher and higher. I think a lot of students like jump in and they say, "Oh, I want to take anatomy and physiology because I want to be a doctor." I don't think that's worth it specifically over like AP Bio. Like that would be way more, AP Bio would be, I think way more worth it in my opinion. But again, I'd rather you not. Some kids I've absolutely had like, oh, I'm going to take AP art history just to get another AP under my belt and not take any math senior year because there's nothing else to take. Well, go ahead and, take that dual enrollment math class. But again, talking this out with your counselor, planning it out in advance is highly recommended.
Be intentional in the things you take. You don't have to take everything. Taking advantage of the opportunities that we kind of talked about before does not mean that if there's 15 APs, you're taking all 15 APs. It's okay to skip one if it doesn't align with your interests. It's okay to, follow those passions, even if it means you're taking like an honors or an on-level class. I think that, as Nicole said, planning is super key, kind of looking at what you have and looking at those interests. Okay, I think we just have like one last little point potentially, and that's how do kids send their AP scores, Nicole?
So, a couple options. You can self-report them on the Common App or whatever other applications that you're using. So basically, you're just telling them that that's what you got. You can also self-report which tests that you're planning to take. So again, you're doing your application senior year and you're taking this test in May. You're going to tell them to self-report there that you're taking it. You only have to officially send the scores to the colleges that you're committing to. And there's typically a deadline for that. So it's essentially an honor system of you self-reporting until you decide to go. Now, don't lie because you can absolutely have your application rescinded if you say, "Oh, I got all fives," and they accept you, and then you actually have to send them the official one, and they realize that you didn't. Um, but the way to send them officially is through the College Board. So similar to how you send your SAT, there is a date where you can send your scores for free up until. So make sure you take advantage of that. I think it's sometime in mid to late June, but it'll probably change each year. And then you can order as many score reports that you want after the scores are released. Like if you need to send them in for something else, but typically you only need to send the official scores to one school.
I think that's like something that always confuses my students is like they know that they, especially for BSMD, you have to send like official scores. So it's your SAT or your ACT. But usually for ACT, you do not need to send those official scores. So save yourself a little bit of money, and just send it to your official ones, official school that you're going to commit to. Make sure to do it by the deadline. If you don't, you won't get credit. I definitely have had kids who didn't submit it in time, and that meant, they didn't get that credit. And so pay attention to each individual school and just make sure you're doing what you should be doing.
Yeah, and even if you're like, "Oh, I got a 5 on AP Bio, but they're never going to take it for bio because I'm going pre-med, so they're going to make me take bio." 100% true, but they may take it for an elective credit.
Yeah.
So definitely still send them in.
So I think that's it for do AP scores really matter for BSMD admissions? If you haven't done so already, don't forget to like and subscribe to White Coat Club, and we can deliver great BSMD and college admissions advice to you every other week. Talk to you later.